It's time for our very first speaker, so make sure that you're ready to take everything in because we're going to talk about behavior and innovation and why it's not easy to stay ahead. Lee Newman will discuss some of the subtle psychological factors that are often obstacles to innovation, and he will propose several behavioral mindsets that can be cultivated to help overcome these obstacles. With over 25 years of business experience, including being the founder and senior manager in 2 technology ventures in New York and the .com era, and prior to that, an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company in Chicago, currently is a dean at the IE University School of Human Sciences and Technology, and member of the executive committee of IE, teaches courses in the area of behavior and leadership. So we got the right person for the right story, and we're glad to present him to you. Lee Newman.
Thank you very much, Lars. A pleasure to be here. Thank you to IASP for having me, and thank you to all of the participants for joining us today. I think your organizations play this incredibly vital role. I mean, you provide science and innovation ecosystems for startups, for SMEs in your local community. So in many ways, you're silo breakers, you're fomenters of progress. To invent, to innovate is essential to business survival. So what I want to do is first lay a little bit of groundwork to address this topic of behavior and innovation. Obviously, I don't need to convince leaders of science parks and innovation areas that for the critical need of innovation, you surely can sell that better than I do. But I do want to make a case that innovation, and particularly sustained innovation in the face of success, is very hard. It's very, very hard. It's hard for teams, it's hard for companies, and it's hard for nations at the national level. And it's about this particular context that I want to share some thinking that comes from the behavioral sciences. So with that, let me share some quick data. I like data as food for thought. So first is this idea of topple rate. So topple rate is a measure that some consulting firms have developed. It's basically the chance that a company goes from being ahead, being a leader in its industry, a dominant position, back to being average again. And you can see the topple rate here in the slide is 0.4. Now, maybe that doesn't mean a lot. So what I've done is translate that into something a little more concrete. If you apply that topple rate to companies, what it says is that of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies, 75% of them today would be toppled in 15 years by the definition that I just gave you. So, making the point that it's hard to stay a leader. Now, if you look at the graph on the right, this is some data from a survey, a global survey that McKinsey did with about 750 US listed companies. And what you see is starting in 2001, 3 groups of companies. The companies in the green line are the ones that were the leaders, the top quintile, so to speak, in their industries. And then the light blue, the bottom of the barrel, and then the dark blue, sort of the more mediocre companies. And what you can see is relative to 2001, what happened to these companies over the years. And what you can see very clearly marked in with the green line is that the best companies went back to being average again. And the worst companies also went back to being average, but from below. So you might say that you see here a kind of curse of success, or what we call in statistics, regression to the mean, regression to the average. It's almost like a law of physics, but it's not. Being great and staying great, I mean, there's no law of physics that prevents that from happening. So then that raises this question, which is the core question I'd like to address, which is, why is sustained innovation so difficult in the face of success, of being successful? And my answer to that question is that it's largely about behavior. It's about psychology, both at the individual level, at the team level, and of course also within companies. So let me make that a little more concrete and move to another visual for you. So it seems that success seems to breed its own demise. It would be great if companies that are successful follow the blue line that I have on the left of the slide, that success breeds a set of mindsets that by default continue innovation. But that is not really what we see happening based on the data that I showed you and many other things. What happens is more that pathway to the right, which is that success psychologically seems to create a set of psychological obstacles that reinforce the status quo. And that status quo reinforcement essentially engenders this regression to the mean, this kind of this built-in sort of demise. And so we're human after all, and somehow we have to figure out how to get over this. But first, let's understand what those obstacles are. So I'd like to kind of walk through each of these different psychological obstacles: resistance to change, experience blindness, overconfidence, and what I call negativity bias here. Okay, so let me just move you forward. So the first is that first obstacle is resistance to change. And so here's some data that I collect. I've done lots of surveying of business executives, middle managers, entry-level employees, and here's some representative data. And I asked the question, what do you think people's attitudes are towards change? And you can see here that the vast majority of people say that people try to minimize change. A lot of people believe that people actually hate or fear change. And very few people are saying that change is something positive or that they seek it out. So I like to always say that in every company, there is a club of people whose core mission is to identify and to squash out any form of innovation they see. I call them the club of the status quo, and their moniker is, you can always count on us because nothing ever changes. So that's the first psychological barrier, is this built-in resistance to change. Most of us don't like it under many, many conditions. Okay, moving forward to obstacle number 2. So I ask people the question, sort of, how do you view your experience in terms of its utility in driving your business judgments and decisions? And what you can see here from the data that I presented is that people generally say, it's a useful factor, and many people say actually it's the primary driver. Almost half the people typically say that their experience is one of the primary drivers of how they make business decisions. And on the contrary, you can see from the data that nobody's saying that experience can be a hindrance, and only a few people say they're wary of it. So here you can see sort of, again, these fundamental, let's say, roots that go against innovation, because we have experienced blindness. I mean, sometimes the past is actually not a very good predictor of what will work in the future. And when we try to build on our experience, it's an efficient thing to do, to rely on what we've done before, what's worked, and avoid what hasn't worked. It can get us into a lot of trouble, and there's a lot of data on that I don't have time to go into, but I call that experience blindness, and that is the second obstacle I like to suggest gets in the way of innovation. Now, moving to the third obstacle, it's overconfidence. So you may have heard of Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, and part of his work was documenting just the degree of overconfidence that we as human beings have. And so if you look at this data, I ask people in companies, how do you think of your own decision making with respect to your peers? Okay, and here you see some typical data. And what you can see is rampant overconfidence. I mean, half of the people say that they're well above others, the rest of the people around them in their decision-making quality. Many people say they're above a bit, and very few people say that their decision quality is lower than others. So rampant overconfidence, not overconfidence in the postural standpoint that I can act confident, but confidence in the quality of my thinking. And of course, innovation requires doubting yourself, right? Doubting your thinking and saying, maybe there's a better way. It's fundamental to innovation and to invention and to the creation of new science, et cetera. So that we'll call the third obstacle, this idea of built-in overconfidence. And then lastly, getting to the fourth obstacle, this one is called in behavioral sciences negativity bias, and it drives something that is relevant here called status quo bias. So let me just explain that briefly. So the curve that you see, the graph that you see in the slide, is the primary part of the work that got Daniel Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics. And what you'll see is that, in a world of negatives and positives, objective losses and gains, the horizontal axis, we win some and we lose some. But what does that mean psychologically? So that's the vertical axis. So when we get something, if I give you 500 of something, whatever it is, you can see that blue box, and it gives you a certain amount of pleasure for getting that 500 of whatever it is. But now take a look at the left side of that curve, the red side. If you have that 500 and I take it away from you, the same 500 that you got, it actually hurts you 2 to 3 times more. And that is a fundamental finding in behavioral sciences, which is this, that negative things have about 2 to 3 times the psychological power over us than positive things. That is, we tend to put more energy into avoiding negatives than to going for positives. Why does that matter for innovation? It matters because in any innovation project, in any change project, right, we lay out the benefits, as I've shown here, kind of in this conceptual blue arrow, and then there's some costs. Let's take the small red arrow first. You know, that project looks good. The blue outweighs the red, so we should do it. Let's go for it. Let's innovate. But the thing is, you got to multiply those costs by 2 to 3 psychologically. And so that those red costs actually psychologically look a lot higher than they would objectively. And all of a sudden, what can be a good project starts to look bad. So, you know, we like innovation conceptually, but when things are going well, are already good, we do ask the question, well, what if we do this? What if it doesn't work? And that's when we get into the left side of that curve, into the red side. So we'll call that the fourth built-in sort of deep-seated psychological bias that makes it difficult to continuously innovate. Okay, let me move forward then and switch to the other side. That's kind of the negative story. That's the bad and the ugly. But what about the good part of this? So we have these 4 obstacles that drive a favoring of the status quo, which makes it very difficult to sustain innovation in the face of change, in the face of continued success. So what we need to get around that, I've identified here are 5 factors that I think are important in terms of what I'll call behavioral agility. Okay, and the good news here is that many of you will recognize that many of these things are things that are quite aligned with best practices in innovation methodologies. So let me review these briefly. So the first is developing or facilitating mindsets in a team or in a company where the idea is that we're not going to passively wait for change to kind of come around the corner and surprise us. We're going to actively track it. We're going to have processes in place that allow us to basically constantly scan our environment for threats and opportunities. The second part of agile mindsets is what I'll call openness to change. The simple idea that you cannot get too comfortable with the status quo. You cannot listen to that club of people, the status quo club, or you're in trouble. So we have to develop a culture, a mindset in our teams that embraces change as something positive, and that's quite important. And then how does that work in practice? So we come to the third mindset here, which is experimentation. Thinking big, but experimenting small. So rather than waiting for consensus to try some big idea, let's try little things and see if they work. And if they don't, let's try something else and let's build on things that do work and try to make them bigger. So that should sound very familiar in terms of agile methodologies. And that leads us to the fourth mindset, the fourth sort of agile behavioral mindset, which is learning and iterating. The idea that we have to try an experiment and fail and learn from those failures and adapt and change and try something else. Not blame each other, but say, hey, great, we tried it, it didn't work, but we learned something and now we can try something else and we know more. And then lastly is another psychological mindset that I think helps with innovation, which is encouraging positive conflict. I mean, there are cultures few cultures that embrace positive conflict, but in many cultures, company cultures and national cultures, we avoid conflict. And that's not good because positive conflict is a critical driver of innovation, right? I mean, we have to have those kinds of difficult conversations to learn from each other and to get to something new that pushes the envelope. So basically, those are the 5 things. Each of those are behavioral, and I think they're quite aligned with the kinds of things we think about when we think about agile methodologies. Okay, let me then ask the question and answer it as well. The question being, are these the kinds of mindsets that are in place in most companies? Are those kinds of things that I just described, those 5 things actually happening? Here's some data from McKinsey in this 2x2 matrix. So they've surveyed companies in terms of their practices, and we can think about corporate practices in 2 types. Dynamic practices, so the ones we typically think of as being agile. So sensing and seizing opportunities, iterating, being transparent, et cetera, many of the things that I just mentioned. But it turns out, at least by McKinsey's definition, which I quite like, that's not the only part of agile. It's very difficult to actually capitalize on all this experimentation if you don't have a performance orientation, if you don't have standardized ways of taking new findings and new ideas and actually capitalizing on them, operationalizing them, putting them into play. And so that's where the stable practices come in. And so by this definition, an agile team or an agile company is one that combines both dynamic and stable practices. And it turns out that by McKinsey's data, only about a little less than a quarter of companies actually fall into that blue box. You have startup mentality, not necessarily only startups, but startup mentality where you have teams or companies that are highly dynamic. They're trying to innovate, they're experimenting all the time, but they don't have any practices to actually allow them to be efficient. And then you have the bureaucratic companies or cultures where everything is stable, the status quo bias I mentioned, and there's very little dynamism. And that, of course, also doesn't lead to innovation. So we need to kind of be in that blue box. The reason I have F. Scott Fitzgerald here is because I love this quote. He says, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and not go crazy." I don't know whether he meant it literally given his hairstyle at the time with these two sides of his head, but this is actually an important psychological idea. We do not like, in general, all things equal, as human beings, we do not like actually maintaining sort of conflicting ideas in our head at the same time. In fact, the whole term cognitive dissonance is about this fundamental human desire that we have to try to get rid of that, to try to have one thing win and let the other thing lose so that we can just have clarity and have one thing in mind rather than two competing ideas. And so it's difficult to have both dynamic and stable practices in mind at the same time. And also it's difficult to recognize that there are good things about the status quo, but it needs to change as a fundamental basis for us to stay ahead of our competition. So that's the main part of what I wanted to share with you, this idea that there are these four fundamental psychological obstacles to sustain innovation. But the good news is that there are mindsets, there are sort of behavioral agility mindsets that we can try to put in place to help teams and companies ensure that they are sustainably successful. So to close, I want to leave you with two suggestions. First, these mindsets of behavioral agility, they're critical to overcoming these deep biases, as I've said. But unfortunately, what I've also tried to share with you is this idea that they're not our default. I mean, humans need a push, teams and companies need a push to do this. And this is where I think it becomes critical for you in the sense that you have these ecosystems that offer your residents and your clients conditions that in theory put in place the conditions that foster behavioral conditions that foster innovation, that foster the right kind of mindsets. And so, one suggestion to you is to think about these 5 mindsets that I share with you. How can you, through your ecosystems, help these companies and teams intensely track and scan the horizon for changes? How can you help them create an incentive system, an environment that rewards openness to change? How can you help them constantly innovate or experiment and test and try and fast fail and learn from those failures? And lastly, how can you help them encourage positive conflict as a culture? I don't have the answers to those things and how you do it in your ecosystem, but I'd like to suggest that I think that is a critical thing that you provide to the clients and residents that you have. And second, I'd like to suggest that you, meaning your organizations, also need to continually innovate. The bad news is that you and your people are the same humans that you've seen all this data that I've showed you, and you will have the same tendencies: resistance to change, overconfidence, experience blindness, and status quo bias that you have to overcome as well. And with the world changing as fast as it is right now, with new ways of working, with teleworking, I can only imagine that you have some innovation to do as science parks, as innovation areas, in thinking about how to maintain your relevance, your attractiveness to your residents, to your clients, to your local communities. I mean, what can you do to innovate and ensure that what you're providing actually addresses the fundamental needs of your customers? And so I hope that these ideas of these psychological barriers and mindsets to overcome them, and that you have the potential with your ecosystems to put in place the conditions to overcome those obstacles, is one of the critical missions perhaps that you could fulfill. So my sincerest best wishes to you in doing this and innovating yourselves and to try to provide this type of environment to your customers. And I hope that you will make the most of this conference to lay some foundations for innovating in your future. So with that, thank you very much and have a fantastic conference.